in completing their PhDs. So this is Liam, Marissa, Paul, Michaela, and Madeleine, and I'll let them introduce themselves to you in a moment. But first off, I should just start with something on the Geochemistry group. So we're a special interest group of the GeolSoc and the MinSoc, and our goal is to promote geochemistry as a discipline and to support those of you in the early career geochemical community. Obviously, our events are also not exclusive to geochemists. Those of you from other disciplines are also very welcome to join. And just a quick bit of housekeeping. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and may be posted online. And the bonus here is that this means you can find, as I mentioned, previous sessions of our Skills and Out of Academia series on our YouTube page. Please abide by the Geochemistry Group's Code of Conduct and be respectful of each other through these meetings. And then in particular, thanks to those of you who in filling in the form have already sent us in questions. So we'll use those in the session today. But if you have any further questions, please add them in the Q&A box. Okay, and so without further ado, here are our 5 panelists for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let each of them introduce themselves. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great that 5 of you could join us. So could you just perhaps start just by telling us something about who you are, as in where you're based, perhaps where you did your PhD, and what area of geochemistry you've been working on.
I'll go. Hello, I'm Marissa Lo. I'm currently working as assistant editor of Geoscientist Magazine, which is the magazine that's sent out to fellows of the Geological Society. So yeah, my background's in geology, and I've just finished my PhD in planetary science at Manchester. So yeah, handed my thesis in May and have just sorted all of the corrections out.
Super, well done. Madeleine, perhaps you want to go next?
So hi, I'm Madeleine. I did my PhD at Durham and I finished earlier this year, and it was looking at transition metal stable isotopes, so iron, zinc and vanadium in granites. I'm currently based at Oxford doing a postdoc. I've done a bit of a swerve into looking at rhenium stable isotopes now, but looking at paleoredox and weathering processes through time.
Excellent, thanks. Good move. And Liam, sticking with that hard rock theme.
Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Liam Hoare. So I did my PhD in Cardiff University, and I handed in my thesis back in November last year. And that was on titanium isotopes, so in high temperature igneous kind of systems. And since kind of the beginning of November last year, I've started a postdoc at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany, kind of carrying on with the high temperature geochemistry, but also doing some experimental petrology as well.
Okay, cool. And Paul?
Hi, everyone. I've recently finished my PhD at UCL, and my PhD was in conditions in the equatorial Pacific during the mid-late Miocene, using stable isotopes and trace elements geochemistry on planktonic foraminifera. It may be of interest that I'm obviously a returner to academia, as you might probably guess, and also I did some of my PhD part-time as well, if that's of interest to people who are not doing it full-time.
Fantastic, and I think that just leaves Michaela.
Hi, I'm Michaela Reay. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Bristol, where I also did my PhD in organic biogeochemistry. Had a brief trip up to Birmingham, but then came back down south for my postdoc, which is on nitrogen cycling and plastics in agricultural systems.
Super. So we've got quite a good range of panelists there. And so we'll start out. The first topic we'll cover is really dealing with starting out. So your first term, your first year. So the first question is, what do you wish you had focused more on when you first started on your program? So for example, in the first term or the first year. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I think the thing I would have liked to have learned more of in my first term was probably R and coding and MATLAB and how to make graphs and statistics. It's something that you only realize you really need probably when you've already got your data set, rather than when you've first got collecting your data set and maybe some other information you want to collect. So I think taking some time to learn R or statistics is actually really worth it. It might be like, this doesn't seem that relevant at the moment. It will be.
Great idea. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to support what Michaela's just said. Actually, I think the time you don't want to be learning something new is when you're under pressure further down the line. I think the difficulty is identifying what it is, the new thing that you actually will need to know somewhere down the line. But there are, there are some things, and I think, coding, stats, etc. If you need to sort of brush up on that and do some work on that, it's best done near the beginning rather than later on, I think.
Yeah, and adding to that, you have the time to do it now. I think a lot of lab-based PhDs actually take a lot longer to get going than you think. I know I definitely didn't have any data till probably basically the end of my first year. So it's worth, while you've got the time, learning this sort of stuff now.
Yeah, I think as well, if your university offers, like through the doctoral academy, any kind of free courses, like for example, Python, LaTeX, MATLAB, etc. Like, yeah, in the first year is really kind of the time to take advantage of that. And maybe testing it out, like writing your lit review or something, is kind of a perfect time to kind of play around with learning those software, because I guess a lot of them have kind of a steep learning curve at the start. So it's not something you kind of would pick up if you're like in the depths of the lab or something like that. So.
And Marissa, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add, it's a really good time to put together a really solid literature review. I know most universities require that first year PhDs do some sort of progress report. I'd really put some good time into getting a good literature review that has all the key references in, because you don't want to be writing up your thesis and then going, what's that key paper that I need to reference, and then scrolling through Google Scholar then. You want to just have a solid list ready to go to put in.
And
fantastic. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, and if you do it well, you can copy huge chunks of that into your thesis.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Maybe,
go on.
Can I just add, there's something about just identifying what some of the key constraints are going to be in time terms. I think if, as you start working out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, I mean, if it's, for example, machine time, and the people who are able, the people who will be helping you to make stuff happen with machines, that's, that can be a critical constraint. And if there's two things about that. I mean, one is just, how do I go about getting access to machine time, and how long was, what's the waiting list and all that sort of stuff. And but also it's about the relationship you need to build, I think, with the people who are going to be critical to your success. So I think it's worth investing in those relationships early on as well.
Yeah, I think to add to that, like all of the lab technicians and kind of lab managers and people like that, kind of talk to them early on, form a relationship. And like, obviously a lot of these things can be stressful if you're working in a busy lab and lots of people are kind of clamoring for time on machines. But yeah, if you build a good relationship, a friendly relationship, that will work in your favor. I mean, these people have a lot on their plate. So, if you can kind of organize yourself, everyone kind of wins, I guess.
Yeah.
And I guess in terms of time constraints, I admittedly, I was quite bad at organizing things at the start of my PhD. I kind of just sort of, went, saw what happened. But I guess like a Gantt chart or something, kind of maybe a rough idea of year 1, year 2, year 3, maybe what you might do or how long it might take is also something to consider.
Yeah, I think on the instrument side as well, learning as much as you can and making sure that instrument isn't a black box in your first year of your PhD will put you in good stead for the rest of your PhD, because inevitably it will break when someone who knows how to fix it is not there. And also it puts you in really good stead for a postdoc. You're going to go to probably a different lab which might not have the same level of technician support. So learning as much as you can in your first year is going to be good for the rest of your career, whether it's in academia or not.
Okay, great. So it sounds like a lot of get to know the people, get to know the logistics, think about what you're going to have to do over the 4 years, learn some computer programs, work out how you're going to make figures. So there's a lot that you can get on with, even when it feels like some things might be quite slow on a project in your first year or so, when you've got some time, when you're not under so much pressure of writing up. That's great. So here's another question which sort of relates to that, and moving on a bit to thinking about the science. Question is, I'm told it's common for less than 10% of a first year research plan to make it into a final thesis. seeing some responses there. How much should you try to plan your entire project early on, and how much should you be open to sending your project down entirely new avenues? So this is very much about planning from the kind of science point of view and the ideas of the science rather than necessarily just the logistics. Who wants to go first there?
I can go. I was going to say, I guess it's tricky to know because a lot of us, because we've just finished, we were affected by COVID. So we had projects that, well, mine anyway, changed a lot from what you thought it was going to be in the first year to what it ended up being. But I think it's good to have a good idea of the avenues you could go down, but also to be flexible to change it, because you don't know what you're going to find out. And if something else is more interesting, you might want to explore that.
Yeah, so for my thesis, again, different universities might do it differently. A lot of people now do it by journal format. So your thesis is like 3 or 4 papers. So from the very start, I planned mine as 3 different papers or chapters, and then had a few little side ideas. So if those main chapters didn't work out, I could bring in a different idea. But yeah, as Madeleine just said, you have to adapt sometime, even if there wasn't COVID and I was working at home, an instrument might break, or you might not get certain samples, or a certain program might not work. So don't be afraid to pick up a side idea and turn that into a main one.
I mean, I finished my PhD before COVID, thankfully. I'm not envious of anyone who had to do that during COVID. But I mean, I think it's also important to give yourself scope to be able to adapt your project to actually what you develop your interest in. You've just started a PhD, you might not necessarily know exactly what your field of interest is, or whether you want to specialise or go down a slightly different avenue. So whilst it's good to plan, it's also good to give yourself scope to develop your own research ideas rather than maybe what's been given to you by your supervisor.
Yeah, I think it's worth, from my experience, I mean, to start with, I grossly overestimated what it was I could do and what I could achieve. Reality bites when you start to do stuff and you realize that everything takes twice as long as you think it's going to. And actually, the money's not going to stretch to this ambition either. So I think with hindsight, I think for me it would have been about having 1 or 2 core deliverables, as it were, but giving yourself some space around that to A, allow for contingencies for stuff going wrong, and B, to allow yourself to be able, because the best bit for me was exploring stuff I hadn't planned to do, which just arose out of the data. And that was actually the most rewarding bit personally. It wasn't actually the stuff I'd set out to do. And I think allowing yourself the space for that, the flexibility, as others have said, is really important.
Yeah, I guess following on from that, I guess in the sort of UK or NERC system, you apply for your PhD project and there's kind of a fixed title looking at X to understand Y. But I think it's also good to realize, depending on your supervisor, that might not be set in stone and you might end up doing something that's completely different to what you started out doing. So, because I mean, 3 years or 4 years is a long time. Something, as other people have discussed, some unexpected stuff could happen. So you might end up doing something completely different, which is, yeah, it's definitely a good chance to explore different options, have something on the back burner just in case. And your supervisor might, is very supportive of that, exploring different avenues of research.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's one of the few times in your academic career when you have such freedom is during your PhD, and that's your chance to go and explore things that you think are exciting or interesting, without anyone else telling you can or can't do that. So absolutely. One final question on this sort of starting out and this kind of topic. What milestones could a supervisor expect at stages through the first year?
I think that's going to be quite variable depending on what type of project it is. Obviously, some are more lab-based, some are going to have method development. I know in my PhD, it was method development. At the end of the first year, nothing had worked. And I was like, it worked out in the end, it's okay. So I think it's going to vary between different PhDs. I think what we've already discussed is like having a really strong understanding of the literature. That is a key milestone in the first year. You might not use much of your data from the first year, but having that really key milestone of the literature review, the understanding of how the lab works and the equipment you need to use and how that works, that's a really big outcome for the first year, not necessarily the data or having a paper draft or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to say have something go wrong in the first year, because that means it won't go wrong later. You know, whether that's an experiment or it's a model, have like properly test something from start to finish, and then you know if it actually works or not. And if it works, that's great. But if it doesn't, at least you've crossed off one option.
I mean, I derived some confidence from, you know, doing a small part of what I was going to do in large, and going from one end of the process to the other. So and you know, that was, you know, I probably it gave me confidence. It possibly gave my supervisor some confidence as well. So and I think also as part of that you know, building a good working relationship with the supervisor is, you know, is kind of critical to that, you know, one in which you are, you know, you're kind of talking to them about what's going on a structured basis as well as an informal basis, and I think that will help to ensure that, you know, if your supervisor has expectations in relation to milestones during the first year, that you're helping to meet those as well, and there's no sort of miscommunication around that.
Yeah, and we will come on to supervisors in a bit.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, I think that's a nice starting point. So a lot of geochemists, not all geochemists, will be doing lab work. So we just want to have a couple of questions on advice about lab work. So first of all, basically, what tips would you have for working in the lab in terms of, for example, scheduling work or record keeping, things that went right, things that went wrong?
Well, I'll start this time, David, if that's okay. I think record keeping, you can't actually keep good enough records, really. I mean, it's really worth recording everything, even if you don't think it's, you know, kind of germane at the time that you're recording it, and also recording it in a fashion in which you can find it again, and then you can understand it when you're looking at it some months, maybe even years later. You know, so I think that's, you know, that's kind of fundamental, really. It's painful, but it's slow work, but it's really, really important.
Yeah, following on from that, early on, it's worth working out exactly how you're going to organize your data and have like a systematic file name that you use every time, and have it in the same folder. Yeah, because suddenly you'll have so much of it that it's too much to deal with. So work that out really early on.
Yeah, I didn't do any lab work during my PhD, but I would say the same bits of advice apply to if you're doing, say, computer modeling. So yeah, having the good file naming system. And then another thing I did was I had just an Excel spreadsheet with the file name and then just a little description of what it actually was. And especially with modeling, you'll be tweaking such tiny things from model to model, just saying what that little thing is that you changed. Your future self will thank you a lot.
Yeah, I think on the lab work side, it's all about preparation. Just get into the habit of having a tidy lab space and having everything prepared. And I think that will put you in good stead throughout your PhD, because having what you need to do in the lab is going to make everything so much more efficient.
And I think the other thing is, I think honesty is really important. You know, stuff goes wrong. You know, you mix samples, you drop samples, you know, all sorts of possibilities for stuff that can go wrong, and that happens. I think, you know, trying to write it down, you know, just be honest about it, because you know, when you get the data back and something looks a bit odd, if it's because it was the sample got mixed with the other sample, then that might be the answer. Much better than you know, pretending it didn't happen, really. So it's yeah, which is, I think that's really it's really important. It's like sort of being honest with yourself about what's happening, and being, you know, being as diligent as you can to make sure that you've done everything to the best of your ability, and where it's gone wrong, you've recorded that.
Yeah, I guess as well, it's important, like, things will go wrong, mistakes will happen, and like, we're all human, so that's just part of the journey. And I guess it's easier said than done to not let them, you know, feel disheartened about that. But I mean, postdocs or other PhDs or your supervisors will have probably made exactly the same mistakes at that point. So I think it's, kind of just live and learn, and, kind of, again, write them, even if it's something wrong or something wrong happened, write it down in a notebook, and maybe then you can start to think about why it happened and how not to do it again. But I think it's part of the journey, and it kind of, like as someone said earlier, if you make mistakes at the beginning, it's actually quite helpful, because hopefully then you won't do them again.
Yeah, no, good point. And it's, that first year is a chance to make those mistakes so that you learn to improve your methods, improve your skill sets, and you'll never make that same mistake again. You might make another mistake, but you'll probably never make that exact same mistake again. So that's definitely very useful. Okay, so a related question then. So you've sort of got in the lab, you've been able to get some data, you're working out, or at least you've worked out your methods, you're sort of trying to do things in the lab, but it doesn't always work out too much early on. So a question we had is, at what point should you start worrying if you haven't collected enough data yet?
I guess I can go first. I didn't get my first batch of kind of usable, like good data until right at the end of my first year. And in my head, I was kind of a bit worried, and I was like, am I going to have enough time to get enough out of this thesis? And I kind of felt really down about it. But I think you can't really compare, each PhD is its kind of individual journey. So I wouldn't, just consult with your supervisor. Your supervisor will kind of give you advice or tell you, maybe we should think about, getting more data sooner, or things like I think it's highly variable. But I think I wouldn't worry about having like a complete publishable data set by the end of your first year, at least.
Yeah, I completely agree with Liam. That was exactly the timescale I was on. I didn't get my first data until the very end of my first year. And because it was an isotope PhD, that was like 5 data points at that point. So, you get a lot faster at what you're doing the more you do it. So if it takes the first year to set up the method and work out what you're doing, work out how to do the measurements, that's fine, because then you'll be able to really crack on with work in the next 2 years.
I think so from my experience was, I had, I don't know, kind of 1,200, samples for isotope data. I was not doing them myself. So I think if you've outsourced the, the actual mechanics of using the mass spec for something like that, then the critical point is that you are on top of whatever lab that it's gone to. You're constantly talking to them and finding out, where you are in the queue and when it's going to come, and all that sort of stuff. Because rather than expecting them to contact you and tell you things, if if there's a hitch, or you've slipped down the pecking order somewhere along the line. And that's stuff this is the difficult stuff that's outside your direct control. Which can be frustrating, but is something you need to pay quite a lot of attention to, I think.
Any other thoughts on that question, or shall we move on? Okay, let's move on. Yeah, so I think that's keep on top of things if it's someone else is responsible for your some step in the process of your lab work, but don't worry if you've got no data till the end of your first year, because all these people have been super successful despite not getting data till basically that stage. And if you have colleagues in your departments who are not geochemists, they may well be ahead of you, or they may well feel like they're ahead of you. Geochemistry and isotope geochemistry are just hard, and a big chunk of your PhD is learning to do these things, learning to be in the lab, learning to get good data. It's not just about sort of getting data on paper and then your PhD starts. It's very much part of the process, I think. So don't worry if you're a bit behind colleagues who are not geochemists. Okay, so you've collected some data, hopefully, and this may be into your second year, etc. Maybe as you're coming to write up. The next topic we have is data interpretation, in science and thinking. So one question we had here is, how much did you rely on your supervisor for help with interpreting data versus developing your own interpretations? Who wants to kick off there?
I think that's definitely a skill you will develop over time, in that when I was first running, say, my computer models, it would just spit out loads of numbers at me. And I thought, wow, this is great. All of this is usable. This is going to tell me loads of things. And then I'd show my supervisor in that first meeting, and he'd go, okay, these are the useful bits. This is the actual stuff that you can take from this. And it then meant when I was using a different model in future, I then got a bit better at picking out the actual useful bits of data. So yeah, I wouldn't worry if you don't have that skill to begin with, because it will definitely develop as you work with your supervisor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a supervisor is really, really important. You know, I suppose as is sort of following, I think, Madeleine's earlier point, you know, as is if you've done a pretty decent literature review, then you should have a sense of what sensible data looks like. I mean, that said, I thought I'd done a reasonable literature review, and yet, you know, there was one strand of data which looked like nonsense, and I sort of semi gave up on it. And it turned out it was much more interesting than I thought it was, and I wish I'd paid more attention to it earlier on. So, but it's very much a learning journey, and it's also one of the great joys, to be honest, is actually exploring the data is a great joy, and just thinking of looking at it in different ways and continuing to plot it up in different ways, and then, you know, compare it with other things, I think is just one of the best bits of the whole thing, for me at any rate, because it's the point at which you go, wow, what's going on here, and the puzzle is you know, is really energizing, I think.
I think something that's also really useful is not to just go to your supervisor. So you'll have postdocs and other PhD students in your lab, and I mean, you can have data discussions, informal coffees, and everyone can bring their own data, and everyone is probably coming from different backgrounds as well. So you can get, I mean, in my lab group in my PhD, we had chemists, we had geologists, we had archaeologists. So you can get different people's interpretations, different people's ideas, and you learn from other people's data. You can input on their data, they'll input on yours. It's just an informal way of seeing lots of different data sets and getting much more used to interpreting them, whether they're your own data set or someone else's.
I think the balance of it also changes through time. I mean, at the start, I think your supervisor has a lot more idea of the project, but then definitely into like your second year and third year, it really becomes yours. And, you know, you'll be coming to meetings with figures you've made and ideas you've had because you're thinking about it all day, every day, and they're not. So, you know, you're interpreting the data more than they are. But I would say in terms of like supervisor meetings, I always found it was more helpful to go really prepared, to go with graphs and to go with like ideas that I had. And because that kind of helps the discussion. There's no point like walking in with a spreadsheet. You know, you need to something to talk about, basically.
I think, sorry, just quickly, I think the other thing is, and this comes back to this thing about giving yourself time to explore stuff that you hadn't expected, is the bit where you see something that you just hadn't, it might be a complete byproduct of what you were first intending to do, and when you see something that just looks interesting, hopefully you've given yourself a bit of time, a bit of contingency time to explore it, but exploring it is you know, is a joy, really, because that bit is all yours. Nobody prescribed this to start with, and it came out of nowhere. You didn't see, you know, you didn't see it coming, and kind of owning that is great.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the most exciting bits in science come when you find things that you didn't expect to find, and it's 2 data points. So then you go and draw a whole study then based on that, rather than what you were originally planning. And that's definitely true of my PhD as well back in the day. Okay, so another question in terms of understanding and getting into that is it okay that I'm spending a lot of time on Wikipedia?
Depends what for.
I mean, Wikipedia can be a good starting point to maybe give you an idea, but I think going past Wikipedia is normally advisable.
Yeah, I guess it entirely depends on what you're looking at. I mean, you can find a list of references at the bottom, so maybe if it leads you on to a paper, that's probably a good thing. But yeah, I guess as someone already said, it depends what you're using it for.
Yeah, I think occasionally there's it's just a quick I'll remind myself about something, kind of, and you don't know, you've got such a massive literature available to you that finding this simple explanation for something that you've forgotten about is quite helpful. But in general terms, I will be aware of, be aware of kind of spending time on Wikipedia, or yeah, I think there are other better sources of information in general terms, I would have thought.
I guess you could also ask your supervisor if there are any sort of like review papers maybe that kind of give you a broad overview, and then you can go through the references within those review papers to kind of find more focused discussions of certain topics.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think for a specific, a sort of statistical technique or some refresher of some meaning of some word, then you may well find Wikipedia useful to direct you in the right direction. But to have something that's sort of secure and reliable in what it's presenting, I think you'd want to look full up on the references and go into the literature. And I think review papers would be a much more much better option in general than Wikipedia for a topic. So find a good review paper on a topic. Yeah, that's a very good point. And one other thing, and this may not apply to all of you, I'm pretty sure it won't, but in terms of having collected data, we have a question which says, what might be the value of machine learning in interpreting data? I don't know if Marissa might be closer to that field than anyone else here, but has anyone had experience with thinking about machine learning in terms of geochemical data?
So I've not used machine learning myself, but in like planetary science in general, I know a lot of people will use it to handle really large data sets. So rather than looking at, say, 10,000 images of the moon's surface yourself, you could get a computer to do that and draw conclusions. Yeah, so I guess it's a very specific, it have to be very specific cases where it would be applicable. So yeah, that's the main application that I could think of for it. And I guess, yeah, it depends on what question you're asking. It might be relevant if you have such a big data set for a computer model to draw different conclusions for you.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so silence suggests most of us haven't managed to collect enough data in our PhDs to require machine learning, because we can try and interpret it ourselves first. But I'm sure for large data sets, basically, and trying to pull apart, maybe if you have your own data and are trying to integrate that with big literature data sets, there may be increasing value in that kind of a direction. Okay, well, I mentioned earlier supervisors, and one or two of you have already alluded to supervisors in some of the answers to questions already. So we had a couple of questions along these lines. I guess the first question on supervisors here is basically, how can you persuade your supervisor to help you?
Well, I think it's really, this is really tricky, and it's so individual, isn't it? The individual student and the individual supervisor, and how you kind of together construct a relationship that's going to support you and be and set the balance really between allowing you to undertake your project, because it is your project, and ensure that you're getting the right advice and support through your supervisor. And I think that's just something that a relationship that you need to build slowly over, particularly at the beginning, and to get a sort of rhythm to it. I mean, you want someone who's going to be responsive and helpful, but you don't want someone who wants to micromanage what you're doing, or who is going to keep expanding the scope of what you're doing, because that's not going to be helpful, potentially, particularly without any meaningful discussion about, if I do this, then what should I stop doing? Because every project is about time, cost, and quality, essentially. And the bit that you really control is the scope of your project, and what's the quality of your learning and the quality of the outcome. So I think that's and that's the sort of, so I guess it's about communication, open lines of communication, and some sort of rhythm to the way in which you're going to work together.
This is as well, a phrase upward management comes to mind of you've got to manage your supervisor. In theory, they should be managing you, but actually part of your PhD is learning how to manage your supervisor and kind of understanding when they're going to be responsive, when they're not going to be responsive, and understanding that they're busy and coming to them with the things that you really need help with, but also setting expectations of actually, if I need help with this, you do need to help me, or we need to communicate about this. So it's kind of having that communication line open and telling your supervisor what you need rather than asking your supervisor what you need.
Yeah, I think, yeah, carrying on the theme of communication, like also honesty. If you have no idea how to do something, like be open and honest about that, and kind of reinforce the fact that, you know, for this particular method or technique, you might need some hand holding to kind of get a better grip on it. And I mean, maybe your supervisor might be super busy, but they might be able to get a postdoc or a lab technician or someone, or a more senior PhD student to kind of show you the ropes as well. So I guess you can also reach out to other people aside from your supervisor to help you as well.
Yeah, I think within the first 6 months to a year of working with your supervisors, you do realize what roles everyone has. So like for me, I had 4 different supervisors. One of mine, he would sign off on all the money things. That was mostly his job. You know, my second one helped with all the modeling. The third one was like the really organized one. So if I needed like, you know, stuff last minute, I could go to her. So yeah, I think part of it is if you want help from them, you need to know what kind of help they offer, because not everyone will offer help on everything.
Yeah, great point.
Some supervisors might just have an open door policy, and you can just kind of come and go freely. If you just have a question, like just poke your head through the door. But I guess some others might have a super busy teaching load or kind of meeting regularly. So you might have to like organize well in advance, like a time for them to help you. Whereas others, yeah, I guess that's the kind of thing you'll learn in the first months, like how to manage each other's schedules.
And I think just following on from Liam's point, I think in addition to doing, if it's a sort of open door, pop in, pop out thing, I think there's value in still having a more structured meeting that's in the diary and on a monthly basis or something, particularly for keeping an eye on the sort of big picture, really, you know, to do that. Well, where are we in relation to the bigger plan? And you know, how is what you're currently doing contributing to that, or do we need to adjust it? Or do you need to adjust it? Because I think the immediate dialogue, you know, I have this issue, this problem, is really helpful. And if you've got someone who's responsive to that, that's great. But also there's a sort of, you can start to lose sight of the strategic in that as well. Okay,
yeah. So I guess be proactive. Would be something I would say, but then be proactive, be honest, and keep track of the short term and the long term. I think there's some very nice advice from all of you there. This sort of almost cropped up with thinking about your supervisors as being, if you have multiple supervisors, as being involved in different parts of a project or having different strengths and weaknesses, which sort of plays into the next question, which says, slightly more challengingly, how do you manage when different supervisors have opposing advice on how to proceed? Has anyone had experience with that kind of a situation?
I feel you get this quite a lot on paper and chapter drafts, or I did anyway, because I had a supervisor who was more an isotope person and one who was more a petrologist. And a thing that was challenging was the different like vocabulary or understanding meanings of words between those two different groups. And they both have ways that they think things could be written better. But I think ultimately it is your decision at the end. So, you know, take the ideas on board, think about it, discuss it all together, but it's okay to make your final decision at the end.
Yeah, I think following on from what Madeleine said, I think it's perfectly fine to have sort of healthy discussion and debate with your supervisor. You know, it's not like their word is the fine, you know, I think you're entitled to have a different opinion and kind of debate and argue about things, obviously, hopefully in a friendly like way. But yeah, I think if you have multiple comments on like a chapter draft or a manuscript draft, yeah, it's unlikely that especially the more supervisors you have, the more likely you'll have differing or divergent opinions. But I think, yeah, trying to take on board kind of what everyone says and find a compromise, or if, you know, you kind of want to stand your ground. I guess there are different ways to approach it.
I mean, I haven't got anything to add except to to reinforce the point about ultimately you're the decision maker. Even though your supervisors know a heap more than you do, they are, you know, in this sense, they're advising you, and you have to decide. And sometimes it's to decide to ignore their advice.
Yeah, very good, Paul. and this situation actually is very much replicates anything. If you continue into science, you'll be working with colleagues, with collaborators on manuscripts, and or you may have reviewers providing comments on manuscripts. And so trying to integrate multiple different viewpoints or different arguments that may or may not all be compatible is just a normal part of science. And so you'll feel that as a PhD student from your supervisors, but learning to do that is really useful. And it's also part of the interest, I think, sometimes in science, is to be able to try and pick what's the useful and important bits from the advice you're getting, and which are the bits that actually maybe don't matter or don't fit with the narrative that you're presenting. Okay, I think that's good on supervisors. Does anyone else have any final thoughts on their supervisory teams and any other advice in that direction?
I think. Sorry.
Oh no, on you go.
I think it's important to look beyond your supervisors sometimes as well. There are other people probably in your group or in other groups in the university that might also be supportive or be able to give you a different perspective. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be your supervisors. There's other lecturers or supervisors that might be beneficial to build a relationship with, not necessarily formally, but there's kind of informal relationships that can really add another dynamic to kind of your research.
I was going to add that a lot of people get nervous emailing their supervisors, especially at the start. You know, we've all been there where ourselves or our office mates are sat there agonizing, like, how do I phrase this? Oh, just make your email clear, because a lot of supervisors, especially if they're teaching and stuff, will only spend a minute or so reading it. So just make it as clear as possible. It doesn't need to be flowery. Polite and clear is all it needs to be. So yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, and possibly even short as well.
Yeah.
If there's
normally short.
Yeah, right. But if there's lots to be discussed, you might want to end up actually doing that in person rather than with a super long email. Okay, super. Let's think about one more skill or one more aspect of completing a PhD, which is writing. Now, we did have a session on paper writing last springtime, I think, and so there may be some useful information there that everyone could go and view as well. But nevertheless, that was more thinking about writing papers, and obviously in the course of a PhD, you may have to write a first year report, you obviously have to write a thesis. So in terms of writing, really one question here is just sort of, how did you learn to write for things like your upgrade report or your thesis? Or just broadly speaking, what tips do you have for writing when you're starting out on a PhD? Good question.
I would say, and I actually stole this from a workshop that I did in my first year, find a paper that you really like. So when you read this paper to begin with, you were like, all of this makes sense. This is really clearly written. And just like save that as inspiration. It could be on a completely different topic from what you're doing, but something about that writing style where you go, that makes sense to me. That flows really well. It's not too complicated. And then try and emulate that. You know, when you're writing something, read that for inspiration and then try and take a bit of a tone or something into your own writing.
Yeah, in terms of like 9-month reports or things you might have to do in the first year, I know in my department anyway, a lot of people sent round versions of theirs to each other just to give you an idea of like the basic structure. Because obviously everyone's is going to be different. You can't copy them. But I think that's often the harder thing to learn, how to structure stuff nicely. So it's good to look at those and to look at like past theses that are online as well to get an idea about that.
I think, I mean, I found it extremely hard, and writing, I don't want to depress anyone, but it didn't ever seem to get any easier, to be honest. It's just, but I suppose the fundamental thing is that don't put it off too long. it generally seems to take much longer than you think it's going to, and you can't sort of write and then kind of fire it off and think you've done. You've really got to write, put it down, come back to it, a week later, read it with attempting to, pretending that you didn't write it, and you're reading it objectively and critically, and edit, and there's to make it succinct, to make it flow. It's just I personally found it just hard work, really. Don't think there's an easy way to do it.
Yeah, I think there's a certain degree of subjectiveness about kind of what makes a scientific what makes a good piece of scientific writing. And I guess touching on the subject of supervisors, they might have differing opinions on how to write a certain section and things like that. Getting a scientific thesaurus is quite good, because that might give you some nice kind of words, to expand your vocabulary, mix it up a thing. But I think, what Marissa said, going through papers that you like, kind of not stealing, but, using them as inspiration, I think is something that's definitely worthwhile.
I think a key thing to learn is to be critical of your own writing, which sounds harsh, but your supervisor will be critical. The first draft will have so much red on track changes. So I think learning to be critical of your own writing and accepting other people's input as well. Yeah. And you can do that just by putting it aside for a week, coming back to it, or a really good way is looking at lots of different papers, maybe having a journal discussion group. You can criticize other people's papers, and then you can see it from a reader's perspective of where the pitfalls might be, and you can apply that to your own writing. But the first draft will always have a lot of track changes from your supervisors.
Yeah, I guess to add on to what Michaela just said, don't take that personally, because usually it's them trying to help and make the writing better. So if you see just a wall of like red and track changes, if that's your first draft, I guess that could be quite disheartening, or a bit like, oh, I've wrote a rubbish piece of work, but it's all part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember having to come to terms with that myself, and actually enjoying editing my own work critically and cutting it down. And you feel like you've written something, taking that down to something shorter feels hard once it's so much in your mind and you've written and worked carefully. But actually, it's that's so much improves the writing. It's actually quite good. Well, I'm not sure I quite go that far, but sometimes can be quite good fun to try and actually improve your own writing.
I guess depending on how you work, it might be better to send or get each of your supervisors or co-authors to comment on the draft separately, rather than maybe having a massive document where everyone's just, so at least then you can individually see, because in certain sections they might have completely different ways of restyling or rewording things to consider.
Yeah, great point. I think there's nothing worse than having 4 people editing a document at the same time. So you can, especially as a PhD student, you have time, and you probably have only a couple of supervisors who are really closely involved. So sort of almost you can send it to one of them, get their comments, understand their perspective, and then send it to a different supervisor, for example, rather than having this document with a multitude of thoughts hitting you. No, that's a great point. Okay, a quick technical one, and then the hour is starting to move through, but one final technical one, and then we'll talk about a few general points to wrap up. So this can be a quick answer if you like, but what programs did you find most useful for making figures? So things like graphs, basically. What do you find the most useful program for that?
I did mine in Python.
I second that. I did Python as well.
I did mine in R.
I use MATLAB or Excel sometimes. Good old Excel.
Yeah, and I used a bit of R, a bit of MATLAB, and quite a lot of Excel and PowerPoint, which sometimes is just fine. I think sometimes you can overcomplicate stuff and go to the more complicated way of doing it unnecessarily.
Oh, and I was just going to say, just to add Inkscape to edit over things that you can't code.
Yeah, I would say don't let, because I guess sometimes there can be a bit of like program snobbery, like there's nothing wrong with making a graph or a figure in Excel. You can still make them look publication ready. So I think whatever works for you is, but I mean, it's a good opportunity to maybe learn some coding, but if you want to make figures in Excel, that's also fine. and you can use Inkscape or some other software to kind of tidy them up, I guess.
Yeah, okay, so there's some good advice, some good ideas for programs from the high tech to low tech. I could add one more in, which is Origin Pro, which is quite neat for paleo geochemical data, because you can plot multiple panels and multiple data sets and things. So it's quite, but it's still quite not too complicated and doesn't require programming. Okay, so we'll move on to more or less almost our last section, which is on kind of the challenges of a PhD and work-life balance during a PhD. So one question, we'll start with this. What difficulties have you had and how did you navigate them? And you may not want to talk about all the difficulties, but I'm sure everyone's had challenges along the way. So how did you get through those? How did you deal with those?
I'd say my main one was related to COVID and not being able to access my office for a good 6 months. So trying to get around that was trying to order like a laptop that I could use at home with all the right programs. But everyone was doing that at the start of lockdown. So instead of, I guess, doing nothing for 6 months, that was when I started shifting focus to like a bit of a side project I had. And eventually that became a chapter in my thesis. So yeah, IT at lots of universities can be frustrating, but hang in there and try and do something in the meantime while you're waiting for them to get back to you.
I mean, I can talk from a just touching. I don't know from the sort of part-time thing. I don't know if anyone is thinking about being part-time. I mean, I was sort of just struggling to manage, family life, another job, and sort of the full-time PhD. And I think it's a bit like if you're thinking about interrupting as well. Perhaps it's really being clear and honest with yourself about why you want to go part-time or why you want to interrupt. It can take some pressure off, but if the difficulties that you're experiencing that are leading you to think about that are more fundamental, then going part-time won't necessarily solve them. So I think there's that that requirement for seeking help and advice in relation to those things. But if you are part-time, it doesn't make, self-discipline becomes even more important, to be honest, because you're a bit more disconnected from university, and you're a bit more surrounded by other distractions. And personally, for me, I found having a clear working pattern and also recording the work that I was doing. I know it's a bit output related, but actually, knowing how much effort I was putting in helped me to sort of keep control of what I was doing.
I think I definitely had difficulty saying no during my PhD, and learning to say no is a very important skill that I probably still need to work on as a postdoc. Your supervisor you'll have a meeting with the supervisor, they'll come up with 5 different ideas. 2 weeks later, it'll be another 5 ideas and stuff like that. So it's important to learn to say no than to say, no, actually, I've got too much on my plate. Let's do this first, and then we can talk about that in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time. The supervisor might forget by then. Or at least mine always did. And just having your hard red line of, actually, I want to finish at 5 o'clock and go home and not have to do work. And that's okay. You don't have to work crazy hours. And it's important that for you define what your red line is and you stick to that. And it's unacceptable for someone to ask you to go over that.
Yeah, I think, exactly. I agree with what Michaela just said. And I think it's kind of, sometimes it could be quite hard. Sometimes you might get lost in things and you realize, I've worked maybe a lot later than I planned. But I think there's definitely, don't feel guilty for taking time off. I mean, you need to, like, the work-life balance is super important. I mean, whatever schedule works for you, maybe you might have a schedule where you might want to do some work on the weekend. That's fine, but I would then try and adjust later in the week to take some time off to make up for that. And if it maybe works, treating it like for me, I treated it like a 9 to 5 where possible. And so making sure I had time on the weekends and the evenings free to kind of completely switch off and not think about science. Sometimes that's easier said than done if you have kind of ideas kind of plaguing your mind. But yeah, don't feel any shame in like, okay, I need a break, because you don't want to burn yourself out. Or if something's gone wrong in the lab, you've had a really bad day and nothing's working, don't try and keep, just just kind of take a step back. Like, I'm just not going to do anything for the rest of the day. Come back with a fresh mind and start again. Don't like push yourself to breaking point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sometimes you need maybe a bit of flexibility when you do geochemistry, right? You need, but you need to learn that, as you say, Liam, like if you've had to work really hard for 3 or 4 days, to, on the mass spec or something, and that isn't always perfectly a 9 to 5 job, probably, then find a way to kind of try and give yourself a reward or a break from that at another time without feeling bad about it. And that's also great, because that was another one of our questions, was along the lines of how many hours per week do you need to work? And I think a few of you have touched on this. And of course, there's no perfect answer, but it shouldn't be more than you should be able to do a PhD, right, in a sort of 9 to 5 days a week, as long as you work hard within that. I think would be a fair way of putting it.
I guess, sorry, I was just going to say, adding on to what you just said, David, like my supervisor was quite honest in the early stages of the PhD, was kind of the way things work in the lab and the mass spec is like, there will be some days that are going to be really long and you will be working late in the evening, just to kind of, a warning, but like, it's fine then. Oh, if I had to come in maybe to check on the mass spec at like 10 in the evening, then the next day, then I would kind of take some time off, and like have a lie in or something, not just kind of working solidly from say 9 to 10 and then back in at 9 again the next day or something like that.
So one more specific question along the lines of sort of how you might get on with work, which was, and this could be answered more generally as well, but the question is, what advice could you give to someone with ADHD and bad memory? But that could be interpreted more broadly, I suppose.
I guess to echo what we've said throughout this is just to write everything down. And again, during that first year is a really good time to understand how you organize yourself best. Some people like to use calendar blocking. Some people write everything down physically. I find like, say if I need to get lots of writing done, I use like the Pomodoro technique, but that doesn't work for everyone. So yeah, if you're in your first year of your PhD, that's a good time to play around with these different organization techniques and see which one works for you. And then hopefully you can carry that forward for the rest of your PhD.
And to work out what time of day you're better at certain things. I know I'm quite good in the morning, but I'm a bit rubbish after lunch and I can't really like focus on anything. So you learn when's a good time to write. For me, when's a good time to go like clean some beakers, and just learn to manage your time like that.
I guess this might vary from university to university, but if maybe the students' union or the university themselves has kind of workshops maybe aimed at, for people with ADHD or kind of other things like time management or kind of just different strategies, if there's any sort of mental health support, I would take advantage of that as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I also think that having a conversation with your supervisor again would be really important, so that they understand how you work, why you might prefer to do things a different way to their expectations of, I think would be really important too.
Okay, perfect. We're probably going to run over by 5 minutes just to give you a chance for a final word. And there's a fine, so I'm sorry about that. If anyone needs to leave, that's totally fine. One question we had, and we can't fully answer this here, and I don't want to put this to you guys, but was basically what would be the funding opportunities for a foreign national doing a geoscience PhD in the UK. And so a couple of points to make here are that one major source of funding for PhDs in the UK is NERC, so the National Environment Research Council. A lot of those places go to home students, but there are a small proportion that would be available, depending on the university, to overseas students. So if you're a really stellar overseas student, then don't rule out inquiring or looking into the doctoral training programs at different universities that are funded through NERC. But there are also some, probably in general, a better route is to look for more specific overseas fellowships. So for example, there are Commonwealth Scholarship Committee have PhD funding available often for projects that are tied into sort of development themes, but a lot of these overlap with geoscience. and that would be obviously relevant to anyone coming from a Commonwealth country. There's also, for specific countries, a lot of specific countries have funding sources. So, for example, I work with several students who are China Scholarship Council funded. So some universities have strong ties there that would allow you to do a PhD in the UK coming from, in that case, coming from China. So I think it's more a case of look at each university's webpage, look into the details, and don't be afraid to contact supervisors, potential supervisors that you'd be interested in working in to help you navigate through that system, because the web pages aren't always super clear to follow. So I think talk to supervisors, send emails to potential supervisors you might be interested in working in is probably your best option for looking into applying to PhD programs as an overseas student. But that wasn't really the main focus of this series, but maybe in future that's something we can think about, as well as thinking about routes for funding. So thank you for that question. Okay, good. Well, we're up to the hour. I'm going to give you one final chance to answer a question, which is, and in fact, well, okay, there's two questions and you can choose which of these you'd like to answer. Okay, make it different. So two questions are, what was the best moment in your PhD? And what one tip would you give as your sort of best tip to a starting PhD student? Or you're welcome to answer both of those if you like, but don't feel like as though you have to.
For the second one, I would say, don't worry. As someone who worried a lot when they started their PhD about getting everything right, and even, you know, to the very end when I was doing my viva and writing my thesis, don't worry. Like, as long as you're putting in a good amount of hours, and hopefully enjoying what you do, it will be okay. Like, you know, a PhD does seem really scary because you are doing so much on your own, but loads of people get through it okay. We have just about made it through okay. So yeah, don't worry about it.
Thanks.
I think my thing would be, don't compare yourself to the other PhD students in the lab. Everyone will reach milestones at different stages. Every project is different, every person is different. All your supervisors are going to be different as well. So try not to go, oh, but so-and-so in the lab has already got X, Y, and Z, because, well, actually, they're doing a completely different project. So try not to compare yourself. It is really difficult, but it probably is better for your mental health to not always be competing.
Yeah.
Go on, Matt.
Oh, yeah, in terms of in terms of like writing tip, if you've established what your methods are going to be, write it then, because it's annoying to have to write it up like 2 years later. So if you've got your methods, write the chapter when you can. But in terms of like a kind of more fun tip, make sure you like integrate into the department, you know, go to coffee, go to lunch with people, make friends, go to happy hour if it's on, and like enjoy yourself, because it should be fun.
I guess, yeah, to add on to that, maybe if you're in a department where maybe you arrive and there's not so much of a strong social bubble, like try and help start that, because like more likely than not, there are other people who feel exactly the same way, but you just need this critical mass to come together. But yeah, I think that also helps sharing in your successes and failures, because as PhD students, we're kind of all going through the same things. You know, you can, if you've had a really bad day in the lab, like chat about it to your office mate, or they'll probably have something else that went wrong, and, you know, kind of support each other, find solidarity in kind of the highs and the lows, because there's plenty of both. But also, if you have opportunities to do like sort of workshops or conferences, like traveling, meeting new people, because you will, you know, some of your money in your kind of PhD grant will go towards funding that. Take advantage of those opportunities as well.
I'll answer the tip question as well. I think my tip would be never, ever, ever be afraid to ask. And that's not just your supervisor. In some cases, it's really not your supervisor. It's you know, it's the lab technician. It's the, you know, it's the you know, it's the postdoc who, you know, knows exactly how to do this thing that you're agonizing about, because there's, you know, there are some things that you've got to learn to do for yourself, and there are some things where actually it's just fine to, you know, to learn enough once, and then you can do it and put it aside, and you know, having friends in those circumstances will be invaluable.
Thanks so much, everyone. yeah, so hopefully that's, some positive tips to take forward into your PhDs. And you can see everyone here is smiling. So at the end of it, at the end of the day, we are doing it because we enjoy it and we think it's worthwhile, but it should be fun as well along the way. So make sure you don't lose track as far as you possibly can of those kind of aspects and the social aspects as well, and working in a group with other people. Fantastic, thanks so much. Sorry for overrunning slightly, I take the blame for that. But I'm really glad that all 5 of you could join and pass on your tips. I wish I would have had a few of those a few years back myself. So thank you, thanks so much. If we didn't manage to get to your question, I think we got through a really good proportion of them, but if you feel as though we failed to answer your question, then feel free to drop me an email and I can provide some input on that. And I think that's all I've got to say, except thank you all for joining. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to those of you that have joined online, and hope to see you in our next session. There should be another session on in the careers in the Out of Academia series before the end of term, and then we will have some sessions ourselves probably after Christmas. So I hope to see some of you again in some of those other sessions. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.